Good evening. Welcome back to Whispered History. Tonight we are going to travel deep into the American plains, to a world of endless grasslands, winding rivers, distant mountains, and enormous herds of buffalo. A world before railroads crossed the continent, before towns and fences stretched across the horizon, before the United States Army moved into the heart of the plains. Tonight, our journey is about the Cheyenne. Their story is one of migration, adaptation, courage, war, loss, survival, and memory. It is a story that reaches back long before the famous battles of the American West, long before Sand Creek, long before the Washita, long before Little Bighorn. The Cheyenne already had a long history. They had lived in different environments. They had traveled across vast distances. They had changed their way of life, and they had built relationships with neighboring peoples that would shape their future. But eventually, they would find themselves caught in one of the greatest transformations in North American history, the expansion of the United States across the continent. And when that expansion reached the Great Plains, the Cheyenne would be forced to make choices that no community should ever have had to make. Fight, move, negotiate, surrender, or somehow find a way to survive. So, before we begin this long journey through the rise and fall of Cheyenne independence, take a moment to settle in. Let the lights become a little softer. Let the noise of the modern world fade into the background. And imagine a time when the horizon seemed almost endless. A time when a person could stand on a ridge and see nothing but grass beneath an enormous sky. If you enjoy these slow, immersive journeys through history, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Whispered History. Your support helps the channel continue creating long-form historical stories that you can relax to, learn from, and perhaps even fall asleep with. And if you're listening late at night, you don't have to remember every name, you don't have to follow every date, just let the story unfold. Because tonight we are not simply going to tell you about battles. We are going to tell you about a people whose history began long before the American frontier came into existence, the Cheyenne. Their own name for themselves is Setse Hesta Hese, often translated as the people. The word carries something important: identity, community, belonging. They were not simply a tribe appearing suddenly in the 19th century West. They had their own traditions, stories, political structures, spiritual beliefs, families, and ways of understanding the world. And their history did not begin on the plains. The earliest history of the Cheyenne reaches back into the northern regions of North America. Their ancestors lived in areas farther east and north than the lands with which they would eventually become associated over generations. The Cheyenne moved. Migration was not unusual among indigenous peoples of North America. Communities adapted to changing environments. They followed resources. They developed new relationships. They responded to pressure from neighboring peoples. And they changed as the world around them changed. The Cheyenne were no different. At one point in their history, they were associated with a more settled way of life than the nomadic image that later became famous. They lived in villages. They practiced agriculture. They grew crops. They depended upon the land around them in ways that would seem very different from the later image of mounted Cheyenne warriors crossing the plains. But history rarely moves in a straight line. The Cheyenne gradually moved westward, and as they entered the Great Plains, their world began to change. The plains offered enormous possibilities. There were rivers, grasslands, wild game, and above all, buffalo. The buffalo would become one of the central forces in Cheyenne life. But another animal would eventually transform their world just as dramatically: the horse. The arrival and spread of horses among the indigenous peoples of the plains changed warfare, hunting, travel, and communication. A person on foot could travel only so far. A mounted hunter could move much faster. A mounted warrior could travel enormous distances. A community could relocate more efficiently. And suddenly, the vast plains became more accessible. The Cheyenne adapted. They became skilled horsemen. They developed a powerful hunting culture. They became increasingly mobile, and their relationship with the buffalo became central to their survival. Imagine the plains before the arrival of the railroad. The grass stretches toward the horizon. A herd of buffalo moves slowly across the distance. Dust rises beneath thousands of hooves. The wind carries the smell of the prairie. Nearby, a Cheyenne camp is preparing for movement. Horses stand quietly. Teepees rise above the grass. Families work together. Hunters prepare for the next journey. Children grow up learning the skills their families have depended upon for generations. This was not an empty wilderness. The plains were home. They were filled with routes, memories, sacred places, hunting grounds, and relationships. Different indigenous nations occupied different regions. They traded, they competed, they fought, they formed alliances, and they sometimes moved when pressure from neighboring peoples became too great. The Cheyenne gradually became closely connected with the Lakota and Arapaho. These relationships would become extremely important. The plains were also changing because of forces coming from far beyond them. European traders and settlers were moving deeper into North America. French and British interests competed for influence. Later, the United States expanded westward. Trade networks brought new goods. Firearms became more common. Metal tools became available, and horses spread rapidly among plains peoples. The Cheyenne adapted to this changing world, but adaptation did not mean abandoning their identity. They carried their traditions with them. They maintained their ceremonies. They developed warrior societies. They established systems of leadership, and they built a culture suited to the environment in which they lived. Over time, the Cheyenne became known as powerful horsemen and formidable warriors. Their reputation would eventually spread far beyond the plains, but that reputation would later be misunderstood. The Cheyenne did not exist simply to fight. War was only one part of their society. There were families, hunters, elders, children, spiritual leaders, women whose work and knowledge were essential to community life, and leaders who had to make decisions affecting entire groups. Their society was complex, and the coming American frontier would place extraordinary pressure on every part of it. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Cheyenne had become deeply connected to the northern and central plains. They followed buffalo herds. They traded with neighboring peoples. They fought when necessary, and they formed alliances that helped them survive. But another nation was moving west, the United States. At first, the distance seemed enormous. The Cheyenne could not have known what was coming. They could not have known that within a few generations, wagon roads would cross their hunting grounds, that gold would draw thousands of prospectors into the west, that railroads would divide the plains, that buffalo herds would be slaughtered on an enormous scale, that military forts would appear across their homeland, or that treaties made with the United States would eventually become sources of bitter conflict. For now, the plains still seemed vast. The Cheyenne still had room to move. The buffalo were still abundant, and their world was still largely their own. But history was beginning to move toward them, slowly at first, almost quietly. A trader arriving at a camp, a distant wagon train, a new military post, a rumor about gold, a treaty proposal. Each event might seem small on its own. Together, they would transform the Cheyenne world forever. And that is where our journey begins, not with a battlefield, not with a massacre, not with a famous warrior, but with a people living beneath an enormous sky. A people who had already traveled a long road before the United States ever reached the plains. They had adapted before, they had survived before, they had changed before, but the changes that were coming would be unlike anything they had experienced. Because this time, the force approaching their homeland would not simply be another neighboring nation. It would be a rapidly expanding country with railroads, settlements, soldiers, and an enormous appetite for land. The Cheyenne would soon have to decide how to respond, and their decisions would shape the next century of their history. For now, however, the plains are quiet. The buffalo are moving across the grass. The horses are grazing. The teepees stand against the evening sky. And the Cheyenne are home. The great transformation has not yet arrived, but on the distant horizon, it is coming. The plains were becoming home. By the early 19th century, the Cheyenne had undergone a remarkable transformation. Their ancestors had lived in different environments, practiced agriculture, and moved through regions far to the east and north. But now, they were becoming a people of the Great Plains. The change was not simply geographical. It changed almost everything. The buffalo became central to their lives. The horse transformed travel and hunting. The open grasslands shaped their communities. And the ability to move quickly became one of the greatest advantages a plains people could possess. A Cheyenne camp could travel with remarkable efficiency. Teepees could be taken down. Belongings could be packed onto horses and travois. Families could move together, and within hours, a place that had been filled with activity could become almost empty. Then the wind would move across the grass, and the landscape would appear untouched. But beneath this mobility was a highly organized society. The Cheyenne were not simply wandering from place to place without direction. Their movements followed patterns. They knew where water could be found. They knew where buffalo gathered. They remembered important locations. They maintained relationships with neighboring peoples, and they carried their history with them. The horse made this way of life even more powerful. Horses allowed hunters to approach buffalo more effectively. They allowed warriors to travel farther. They made it possible to transport more belongings, and they connected distant communities. But horses also changed warfare. A mounted warrior could appear suddenly, strike, and disappear across the plains before an enemy could respond. The Cheyenne became highly skilled horsemen. Their horses were valuable. They were carefully selected and cared for. A good horse could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Horses also became symbols of wealth and status. A successful warrior might acquire horses through trade, raids, or gifts. The size and quality of a man's horse herd could influence his position within the community. But the most important resource remained the buffalo. The buffalo was everywhere. For the Cheyenne, it provided food, clothing, shelter materials, tools, and many other necessities. Almost every part of the animal could be used. Meat provided nourishment. Hides could become clothing, blankets, coverings, and containers. Bones could be shaped into tools. Sinew could become strong cord. Nothing needed to be wasted. The buffalo was not simply an animal to hunt. It was part of the foundation of life. And because the Cheyenne depended so heavily upon buffalo, their movements were closely connected to the herds. When buffalo moved, the people moved. When the herds became difficult to find, the journey became longer. This created an intimate relationship between the Cheyenne and the landscape. The plains were not an empty place between destinations. They were a living world. Every river had meaning. Every valley could become a campsite. Every trail could hold memories. Every distant ridge could mark a place where something important had happened. And the Cheyenne were learning to read this enormous landscape. They were also building relationships with neighboring nations. The plains were populated by many indigenous peoples: the Lakota, the Arapaho, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Pawnee, the Crow, the Blackfeet, and many others. Sometimes these nations traded, sometimes they hunted near one another, sometimes they formed alliances, and sometimes they fought. The arrival of horses and firearms increased the importance of these relationships. A community with strong alliances could be safer. A community with access to horses and weapons could become more powerful. The Cheyenne developed especially close relationships with the Arapaho. Over time, the two peoples became important allies. They shared parts of the plains. They sometimes traveled together, and they supported one another in times of conflict. Their alliance would become extremely important when American expansion reached the region. But the Cheyenne also faced powerful rivals. The Comanche and Kiowa dominated parts of the southern plains. The Pawnee occupied important areas farther east. The Crow controlled territories to the west and north. Competition over hunting grounds could become intense. Yet warfare among plains nations was not always a total war, aimed at destroying an entire people. There were many different reasons for conflict. Horses could be taken. Honor could be defended. Enemies could be challenged. Young warriors could gain status, and communities could retaliate for earlier attacks. Warrior societies developed important roles within Cheyenne culture. Young men could prove their courage through difficult acts. But being a warrior was not simply about violence. Courage, discipline, generosity, and responsibility mattered. A respected warrior was expected to contribute to the community. Leadership was not simply about commanding others. It involved reputation, relationships, wisdom, and the ability to make decisions that protected the people. This would become increasingly important as the Cheyenne encountered American officials. The United States government often expected Native leaders to speak for entire nations, but Cheyenne political life was more complicated. Different bands could have different leaders, different families could have different priorities, and a leader who agreed to something did not necessarily have the power to force every Cheyenne person to accept it. This misunderstanding would later create enormous problems. American officials would sign treaties with representatives. Then they would expect everyone to follow those agreements. But the Cheyenne themselves might understand the agreements differently. Some leaders might believe they had protected their people. Others might believe they had given away too much. Still others might refuse to accept the treaty entirely. These differences would become increasingly important. For now, the Cheyenne world was still strong. Their communities were mobile. Their alliances were growing. Their warriors were respected. And the buffalo herds seemed almost limitless. But change was already approaching. American traders were moving farther west. The fur trade was expanding. European and American goods were entering the plains. Metal knives, blankets, cloth, firearms, ammunition, and other manufactured products began appearing in indigenous communities. Trade could be beneficial, but it also created dependence. A community that became accustomed to certain goods might eventually need access to them. And traders became important intermediaries between indigenous peoples and the expanding American economy. The fur trade also connected the plains to a much larger world. A beaver pelt taken hundreds of miles from the nearest American settlement could eventually end up in an eastern city, the plains were becoming connected to markets far beyond the horizon. The Cheyenne were not isolated. They were participating in a changing continent, and they were adapting as they always had. But there was a difference. The forces now approaching were growing faster than the Cheyenne could have imagined. American settlers were moving west. The United States was acquiring enormous territories. Explorers were mapping the plains. Military expeditions were crossing the region, and wagon trails were beginning to appear. At first, these travelers were few. A wagon passing across the horizon might have seemed like a strange curiosity, but gradually there were more and more. Then came trading posts, then forts, then roads, then thousands of emigrants. The plains were becoming a route toward the west, and the Cheyenne hunting grounds were increasingly being crossed by people who did not belong to the old network of plains nations. This created tension. The Cheyenne had always adapted to neighboring peoples, but these newcomers were different. They did not simply want to trade. Many wanted land. They wanted farms. They wanted towns. They wanted roads. They wanted access to rivers and resources, and the United States government wanted to connect the continent from east to west. The Cheyenne were standing directly in the path of that expansion. Still, the full danger was not yet obvious. The buffalo remained, the horses remained, the camps remained, the horizon remained open. The Cheyenne could still move, and for a while, it seemed as though the plains were large enough for everyone. But the illusion would not last. The first major American trails were beginning to cut through the heart of the plains. Wagons rolled westward. Travelers crossed hunting grounds. Military posts appeared. And every new road brought more people. The Cheyenne watched. They adapted. They negotiated. And sometimes they resisted. The great transformation of their world had begun, not with one battle, not with one treaty, but with thousands of small changes. A wagon here, a trading post there, a new trail across an old hunting ground, a new fort on the horizon. And slowly, the Cheyenne began to realize that the world around them was becoming crowded. The endless plains were no longer endless. The future was approaching, and soon, the Cheyenne would have to decide how to live in a world where their homeland was becoming the destination of someone else's dreams. The world around the Cheyenne was changing. At first, the changes seemed small. A trader arriving with a bundle of cloth, a wagon appearing on the horizon, a few strangers following an old trail across the plains, a new trading post near a river. None of these things by themselves seemed powerful enough to threaten an entire way of life, but together they were the beginning of something enormous. The United States was expanding westward, and the Cheyenne were living directly in its path. By the early 19th century, the Great Plains had become a meeting place for many different peoples. Native nations had their own territories, alliances, rivalries, and trading networks. European and American traders entered these networks looking for valuable goods. The fur trade was one of the most important. Beaver pelts were highly prized in distant markets. Traders traveled into regions that had once been known mainly to indigenous hunters. They depended heavily on native knowledge. Native guides understood the rivers. They knew the trails. They knew where animals could be found. And they understood the political relationships of the plains. The Cheyenne participated in this growing trade. They exchanged animal products for manufactured goods. Metal tools were useful. Cloth was useful. Guns could change the balance of power. A trader might arrive with goods from hundreds of miles away. And in exchange, Cheyenne hunters could provide valuable hides and other products. Trade created opportunities, but it also created new problems. Firearms became increasingly important. A community with better access to guns could become more powerful than a neighboring community. A shortage of ammunition could become a serious weakness, and trade relationships could influence political alliances. The plains were becoming connected to a much larger economic system. Then came the wagon roads. As American settlers moved toward the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific coast, trails crossed the Great Plains. One of the most important routes became the Santa Fe Trail. Another major route later became the Oregon Trail. These roads were not simply lines on a map, they passed directly through native hunting grounds. Thousands of travelers began crossing areas where the Cheyenne hunted buffalo. Wagons needed water, horses and oxen needed grass. Travelers needed wood and food. The trails therefore brought constant pressure. At first, the Cheyenne could sometimes trade with travelers. They could observe them, they could negotiate, they could demand compensation for the use of resources. But there were also misunderstandings. Travelers sometimes believed they were crossing empty land. The Cheyenne knew that the land was not empty. It belonged to living communities. It contained hunting grounds and sacred places. A wagon train might see a stretch of grass. A Cheyenne hunter might see a place where his family had hunted for generations. These different understandings of land would become one of the central problems of the American West. The United States government also began negotiating treaties with native nations. The government wanted safe passage for travelers. It wanted roads and communication routes, and it wanted to reduce conflicts between settlers and indigenous communities. Treaties were presented as agreements, but they were often understood differently by the two sides. American officials frequently thought in terms of fixed boundaries. Native leaders often understood agreements through relationships, shared use, and practical obligations. The differences could be enormous. A treaty might promise peace, but if settlers continued moving through native hunting grounds, the peace could quickly break down. The Cheyenne were caught in this growing tension. They had to decide how to respond to the increasing number of American travelers. Some leaders believed negotiation was necessary. Others believed the newcomers had already taken too much. And many Cheyenne simply wanted to continue living as their ancestors had. The problem was that the Americans kept coming. Then, in the 1840s and 1850s, the pace accelerated. The United States was acquiring vast territories. The Oregon country was attracting settlers. The California gold rush of 1849 brought enormous numbers of people westward. Suddenly, the plains were no longer simply a distant wilderness to most Americans. They were a highway to opportunity. Thousands of immigrants crossed the country. The Cheyenne watched the trails become crowded, wagon after wagon, day after day, week after week. The noise of wheels and animals became a familiar part of the landscape. And with every passing wagon, the pressure increased. The travelers needed water, they needed firewood. They sometimes hunted buffalo. They sometimes left waste behind. They could disturb herds, they could spread disease, and they could bring conflict. The Cheyenne were not passive observers. They negotiated, they traded, they sometimes demanded payment, and sometimes they attacked travelers. These attacks were often portrayed in American newspapers as random acts of violence. But the reality was more complicated. There were years of growing tension. There were disputes over resources. There were killings on both sides. And there was a profound disagreement over who had the right to use the land. The United States government responded by sending soldiers. Military forts began appearing across the plains. At first, these forts were intended to protect travelers, but to the Cheyenne, a fort could also represent something else: permanent American power. Soldiers were no longer simply passing through, they were staying. The presence of soldiers changed the balance of power. The Cheyenne had their horses, their weapons, their knowledge of the plains, their alliances, but the United States had a growing army supported by a rapidly expanding economy. The difference would become increasingly important. In 1851, representatives of several Plains nations met with the United States at Fort Laramie. The result was the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The agreement attempted to establish territories for different native nations and guarantee safe passage for American travelers. The Cheyenne and Arapaho were among the peoples involved. The treaty appeared to offer a way to reduce conflict, but the peace would not last. The reason was simple. The number of Americans moving west continued increasing, and the pressure on native lands continued growing. Then came another transformation: gold. In 1858, gold was discovered in the region that became Colorado. The news spread rapidly. Thousands of prospectors rushed west. The Pikes Peak gold rush brought even more Americans into the plains. Roads became crowded, settlements appeared, mining camps grew, and the demand for land became greater. For the Cheyenne, this was another warning. The people arriving were not simply travelers passing through. They intended to stay. They wanted farms. They wanted mines. They wanted towns. They wanted permanent possession of the land. The old idea that the plains could be shared temporarily was beginning to disappear. The Cheyenne were being pushed into an impossible situation. If they moved, where would they go? If they stayed, how could they stop the settlers? If they negotiated, would the agreements be respected? And if they fought, could they withstand the growing military power of the United States? There were no easy answers. Some Cheyenne leaders chose diplomacy. Others continued resistance. Many people tried to do both. They wanted peace, but they also wanted to protect their homes. And as American settlement expanded, those goals became increasingly difficult to reconcile. The Cheyenne were also experiencing changes within their own world. Their alliances with the Arapaho remained important. Their relationships with the Lakota continued developing. Trade and warfare connected different plains nations. The growing presence of Americans sometimes encouraged native nations to cooperate, but it could also create new rivalries. The plains were becoming a place of constant movement. American settlers moved west. Native communities moved in response. Military units moved along trails. Buffalo herds shifted, and everyone competed for access to water, grass, and hunting grounds. The old balance was disappearing. Then, in 1861, the United States entered the Civil War. The country turned its attention toward a massive conflict in the East. But the plains did not become peaceful. Instead, the absence of large numbers of regular troops created new tensions. The United States still wanted control of western routes. It still wanted settlers to move west, and it still wanted the plains secured. The Cheyenne would soon find themselves caught in a rapidly escalating conflict. Treaties would be made. Treaties would be broken. Settlers would die. Native people would die. Soldiers would be sent. And eventually, the Cheyenne would experience one of the darkest moments in their history. It would happen in Colorado, at a place called Sand Creek. The events there would change the relationship between the Cheyenne and the United States forever. But before that tragedy, there was still a brief moment when some leaders believed peace might be possible. They would travel to government officials. They would negotiate. They would try to explain their position. They would attempt to protect their families, and they would discover a painful truth. Sometimes, an agreement means very little when the people with the greatest power no longer intend to honor it. The Cheyenne were about to enter the most dangerous chapter of their history. The year was 1861. Across the United States, a great crisis was beginning. The country was dividing over slavery, states' rights, and political power. Soon the Civil War would consume the nation. But far from the main battlefields, another conflict was beginning to grow. Across the Great Plains, American settlers continued moving west. Military roads expanded, trading posts became towns, and native nations watched their hunting grounds shrink. For the Cheyenne, the pressure was becoming impossible to ignore. The old world of open grasslands was changing. The buffalo were still there. The horses still moved across the prairie. The camps still followed the herds. But now, there were more fences, more wagon trails, more soldiers, and more settlers. The Cheyenne had already experienced decades of tension with Americans. Treaties had promised peace, but those promises had repeatedly been followed by new demands. Land that had once been considered theirs was suddenly described as government territory. Hunting grounds were turned into routes for immigrants, and every new wave of settlers created new conflict. In Colorado, the pressure was especially intense. The discovery of gold had transformed the region. Thousands of Americans had rushed into the area. Denver grew quickly. Mining settlements appeared, roads crossed native hunting grounds, and buffalo herds were disturbed by increasing human activity. The Cheyenne and Arapaho were now living alongside a rapidly growing American population. The relationship was fragile. Some people wanted peace, others wanted the newcomers gone. American settlers were also frightened. Stories of attacks on travelers spread rapidly. Newspapers often presented native resistance as proof that the plains were dangerous. Fear created anger. Anger created demands for military protection. And military protection created more soldiers. The cycle continued. During the Civil War, the situation became even more complicated. Many regular U.S. Army troops were needed elsewhere. Volunteer units were organized in the Western Territories. One of these units would become central to the tragedy that followed, the 1st Colorado Volunteers. They were commanded by Colonel John Chivington. Chivington was a former Methodist minister who had become a military officer. He was strongly opposed to native resistance. As tensions increased, he became one of the most aggressive voices demanding military action against the Plains nations. But not every Cheyenne leader wanted war. One of the most important leaders was Black Kettle. Black Kettle understood the growing power of the United States. He knew that a prolonged war could bring terrible consequences for his people. He therefore tried to maintain peace. He traveled. He negotiated. He spoke with American officials. He attempted to find a place where his people could live without constant conflict. Other Cheyenne leaders were less willing to compromise. The divisions were not simply between peaceful and violent people. The situation was more complicated. Different leaders were trying to protect their communities in different ways. Some believed negotiation could preserve their people. Others believed negotiation had already failed, and many ordinary families simply wanted to survive. In the summer of 1864, the situation became extremely tense. Attacks had occurred on both sides. Livestock had been stolen. Travelers had been killed. Native people had also been killed. Rumors spread quickly. Each side became more suspicious of the other. Then came an opportunity for peace. Black Kettle and other leaders sought assurances from American officials. They were told that if they came to a designated area near Fort Lyon, they would be safe. The Cheyenne were instructed to camp at Sand Creek. It was presented as a place where they could remain under military protection. Black Kettle believed the promise. He and his followers moved to the area. Their camp was not a war camp. There were women, children, elders, families. Some warriors were present, as they would be in any Cheyenne community. But many of the people there believed they had followed instructions from the authorities. They believed they were seeking peace, and they had reason to believe that their cooperation would protect them. Then, before dawn on November 29th, 1864, the soldiers arrived. Hundreds of Colorado volunteers moved toward the Cheyenne camp. The soldiers were heavily armed. The camp was largely unprepared. Black Kettle raised an American flag above his lodge. He hoped the soldiers would recognize the camp as friendly. Some accounts also describe a white flag being displayed. Black Kettle wanted to show that his people did not intend to fight, but the soldiers continued advancing. Then, the shooting began. What followed became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. The soldiers attacked the village. People tried to escape. Families ran toward the creek. Some dug into the sand for protection. Others fled across the open ground. Black Kettle survived, but many others did not. Women were killed. Children were killed. Elders were killed. Warriors were killed. The exact number of Cheyenne and Arapaho deaths has been debated, but the massacre clearly caused enormous loss of life. The soldiers remained at the camp for hours. When the fighting ended, the village had been destroyed. The survivors were traumatized, and the meaning of the event would become impossible to erase. For the Cheyenne, Sand Creek was not simply another battle. It was a betrayal. People who had sought protection had been attacked. A promise of safety had been broken. And the massacre convinced many Cheyenne that peace with the United States could no longer be trusted. The consequences were immediate. Some Cheyenne leaders who had favored peace lost influence. Warriors who had been reluctant to fight now had a powerful reason to resist. The Plains conflict expanded, raids increased, military expeditions followed. The Cheyenne joined with other native nations in attacks against American settlements and transportation routes. The war was no longer simply about hunting grounds. It had become a struggle for survival. Across the plains, the response to Sand Creek spread. The Cheyenne remembered the names of those who had died. Families carried the trauma forward, and the United States government eventually faced criticism for what had happened. Some members of Congress investigated the massacre. Witnesses testified. The truth became difficult to hide. Even within American society, people were horrified. But the damage had already been done. The Cheyenne had learned a painful lesson. Even when they tried to negotiate, they could not be certain that American military officers would honor the promises made to them. Black Kettle's desire for peace had not protected his people, and the massacre would shape his decisions for the rest of his life. Yet Black Kettle did not immediately abandon diplomacy. That is one of the most tragic parts of his story. Even after Sand Creek, he continued seeking peace. He understood that the United States was too powerful to defeat permanently. He wanted his people to survive. He wanted their families to have somewhere safe to live. He wanted an end to the killing. But other Cheyenne leaders believed that continued resistance was necessary. They had seen what happened at Sand Creek. They did not trust American promises, and they believed that only strength could protect their communities. The Cheyenne were now divided between different strategies. Some wanted peace, some wanted war, some tried to do both. But there was no easy path. The United States was expanding, the army was growing stronger, settlers continued arriving, and the buffalo were becoming increasingly important as a source of independence. The Cheyenne could still fight. Their warriors were skilled. Their horses were fast. Their knowledge of the plains was extraordinary. But the United States had something the Cheyenne could not easily match: an expanding population, industrial resources, railroads, manufactured weapons, and an organized military. The balance was slowly shifting. Still, the Cheyenne would not simply disappear. Sand Creek had created anger. It had created grief. But it had also created determination. The people who survived would carry the memory of the massacre into the wars that followed. The names of the dead would be remembered, and the Cheyenne would continue fighting for their homeland. The plains would soon become a vast battlefield. Military forts would multiply. Railroads would move deeper into native territory, and Cheyenne warriors would strike back. But Black Kettle would continue searching for another path. He would travel to negotiate again. He would trust American promises again, and eventually, that trust would lead him to another battlefield, a place called the Washita River. There, only a few years after Sand Creek, Black Kettle and his people would once again face the United States Army. And once again, the dawn would bring soldiers. The winter after Sand Creek was a difficult one. For the Cheyenne, the memory of the massacre remained fresh. Families mourned, Survivors carried stories of what they had seen. And throughout the plains, the relationship between Native communities and the United States had become even more bitter. The attack at Sand Creek had changed something fundamental. Before the massacre, some Cheyenne leaders still believed that negotiation might protect their people. Afterward, trust became much harder. The Cheyenne had learned that even a promise of safety could end in violence. Yet the fighting did not stop. Instead, it spread. Cheyenne warriors joined with other Plains nations in attacks against American settlements, military posts, and transportation routes. They understood the growing importance of the trails crossing their homeland. If American expansion depended upon those trails, then the trails could become targets. Wagons were attacked, stock was taken, travelers were threatened, and military escorts were forced to protect the roads. The United States responded by sending more troops into the plains. What had once been a series of local conflicts was becoming a much larger war. The Cheyenne were not fighting alone. They had relationships with the Arapaho and Lakota. Different groups sometimes joined together against a common enemy. Their cooperation made them more difficult for the army to defeat. A military force might locate one village, only to discover that warriors from another community had joined the fight. The plains were enormous. A small group could disappear quickly. A mounted warrior could travel dozens of miles in a day. And the Cheyenne knew the country intimately. For the army, finding an enemy was difficult enough. Keeping track of them was even harder. But the United States had a powerful advantage. Its population was growing, its railroads were expanding, and its military could establish permanent bases deep within the plains. Every new fort reduced the space in which Native communities could move freely. Every new settlement created another source of pressure. Every new railroad brought more people. The Cheyenne could win individual encounters. But the larger map was changing against them. Still, many Cheyenne warriors refused to surrender. They remembered Sand Creek. They remembered the people who had been killed. And they believed that accepting American control would mean abandoning everything their ancestors had protected. Among the most respected warriors was Roman Nose. He became famous for his courage and his ability as a fighter. Roman Nose was associated with the Cheyenne resistance during the Plains Wars of the 1860s. He represented a different path from Black Kettle, where Black Kettle repeatedly sought negotiation. Roman Nose became associated with resistance. The difference between the two men reflected a larger debate within Cheyenne society. How could the people survive? Could peace still work? Or had the United States demonstrated that only resistance could protect them? There was no simple answer, and there was no single Cheyenne position. Different bands and families made different decisions. Some remained close to Black Kettle. Others joined more militant leaders. Some moved with the Lakota. Some attempted to remain away from American settlements. Others began considering agreements with the government. The Cheyenne were not one unified army. They were a people facing an enormous crisis. In the years after Sand Creek, the government continued negotiating treaties, but the promises of earlier agreements had already been badly damaged. The Cheyenne had seen land disappear. They had seen settlers arrive. They had seen soldiers attacked. And they had seen treaties changed when American interests changed. Every new agreement, therefore, carried suspicion. Could the United States be trusted? Could a reservation protect the people? Would the buffalo remain? Would settlers stay away? Would soldiers honor the borders? These questions became increasingly urgent. Meanwhile, the buffalo still provided an alternative to dependence. The great herds allowed Cheyenne communities to continue living outside the reservation system. As long as the buffalo remained, a family could hunt, community could move. Food did not have to come from an American agency. The buffalo therefore became more than an animal. They represented independence. And this is why the destruction of the herds would eventually become such a powerful weapon against Plains nations. The United States did not need to defeat every warrior in battle. It could destroy the economic foundation that allowed the resistance to continue. But that transformation was still underway. For now, the Cheyenne continued to fight. American military expeditions moved across the plains. Scouts searched for camps. Cavalry patrols followed trails. Sometimes the army found nothing. Sometimes it found abandoned camps, and sometimes it found a community that had no intention of surrendering. The fighting became a cycle. The army advanced. Native communities moved. Warriors attacked. Soldiers pursued. Winter arrived, then spring. The pattern repeated. But every year the balance became more unequal. The United States could replace lost soldiers. The Cheyenne could not easily replace lost hunters, horses, and food. Every death affected a small community. Every destroyed herd mattered. Every lost horse made movement more difficult. The war was becoming a contest of endurance, and the Cheyenne were being forced to endure more than they could indefinitely sustain. Still, they had moments of success. They could defeat small military detachments. They could attack supply lines. They could disappear before larger forces arrived. They could use the terrain to their advantage, and they could coordinate with other native nations. The army therefore faced a frustrating opponent. The Cheyenne were not easy to defeat, but the United States was becoming increasingly determined. The government wanted Western territories open to settlement. Railroad companies wanted safe routes. Miners wanted access to gold and other resources. Farmers wanted land. And politicians wanted the West incorporated more completely into the expanding nation. Native independence stood in the way of all of these ambitions. That made the conflict larger than the question of one hunting ground. It was about who would control the future of the plains. For the Cheyenne, the answer was deeply personal. Their homeland was not simply valuable property. It was where their ancestors had lived, where their families hunted, where their ceremonies were held, where their stories were connected to the landscape. Losing the land meant losing more than territory. It threatened the foundations of their culture. That was why surrender was so difficult, and why some leaders continued fighting even when the odds were becoming impossible. Among those leaders was Black Kettle. He still hoped peace could protect his people. He had seen the horror of Sand Creek. He did not want another massacre. He believed negotiation might be the only way to prevent further destruction. So he continued seeking agreements. Eventually, Black Kettle and other leaders traveled to meet with American officials. They hoped that peace could be restored, but the larger conflict continued. And another army commander was preparing a campaign against the Cheyenne. His name was George Armstrong Custer. Custer had become famous during the Civil War. He was aggressive, he was willing to take risks, and he believed in attacking quickly. In the winter of 1868, Custer was sent into the southern plains with the 7th Cavalry. His target was a Cheyenne village along the Washita River. The village belonged to Black Kettle, and Black Kettle believed that he was under the protection of the United States. He had already survived Sand Creek. He had tried to make peace. He had placed his people near a location where he believed they would be safe. But before dawn on November 27th, 1868. Custer's soldiers approached the village. The camp was quiet. Families were sleeping. Horses stood nearby. The soldiers surrounded the village. Then, the attack began. Gunfire broke the morning silence. Cheyenne warriors rushed to defend their families. People tried to escape. Some ran toward the river. Others moved into the surrounding hills. The fighting was fierce. Black Kettle and his wife attempted to flee. They did not survive. The man who had spent years seeking peace was killed while trying to escape the soldiers. The attack became known as the Battle of the Washita, but for many Cheyenne, it was remembered as another devastating attack on a village, another reminder that peace had failed, another reminder that the United States Army could strike even after promises had been made. The Washita was another turning point, and Custer's reputation grew. He had destroyed a Cheyenne village. The Army considered the operation a success, but the Cheyenne remembered something different. They remembered Black Kettle. They remembered the families. They remembered the dead. And they understood that their world was becoming smaller. The Cheyenne had survived Sand Creek. They had survived years of warfare. But now another message had been delivered. The United States Army was not going to stop. The plains were closing around them, and the future would become even harder. The winter of 1868 had left the Cheyenne with another painful memory. Black Kettle was dead. The village along the Washita River had been attacked. Families had been scattered, and once again, the promise that peace might protect them had failed. For the Cheyenne, the loss was more than the death of one leader. Black Kettle had represented a path. He had believed that negotiation could preserve at least part of his people's homeland. He had met American officials. He had signed agreements. He had tried to convince his people that cooperation might prevent further bloodshed. But the attack at the Washita had shown how fragile those hopes were. The Cheyenne now faced a difficult reality. Their world was shrinking. The buffalo were still abundant in many areas, but American hunters were beginning to destroy the great herds. Settlers were moving deeper into the plains. Military forts were multiplying, and railroads were beginning to change the landscape. The Cheyenne could still ride across enormous distances. They could still hunt. They could still fight. But every year there seemed to be less room in which to do it. The government increasingly wanted Native people to settle on reservations. Officials argued that farming would replace hunting. They promised that reservation life would bring stability. They promised supplies. They promised protection. But many Cheyenne understood what was hidden behind those promises. A reservation meant boundaries. It meant less freedom to move. It meant dependence on government agencies. And it meant leaving behind many of the places connected to their history. For a people whose lives had become closely connected to the movement of buffalo and horses, that was an enormous change. Still, some Cheyenne leaders believed adaptation was necessary. They understood that the United States was too powerful to simply push back. The army could keep returning. Settlers would keep coming. The buffalo would keep disappearing. And eventually, the old way of life might become impossible. The question was how to survive without losing everything. This debate divided communities. Some people chose to remain away from reservations. They continued hunting. They traveled with other resistant groups. They followed the buffalo. Others accepted reservation life. Still others moved between the two worlds. There was no single Cheyenne response. The people were making different decisions according to their circumstances. And those decisions could change over time. Meanwhile, the United States continued its westward expansion. The railroad became one of the most powerful forces transforming the plains. Tracks crossed areas that had once been used by buffalo and native hunters. Railroad towns appeared, more settlers arrived, markets expanded, and the buffalo became targets of commercial hunting on an enormous scale. The destruction of the buffalo was devastating. Hunters could kill animals faster than the herds could recover. Sometimes they killed buffalo simply for their hides. The rest of the animal was left behind. From the perspective of the hunters, the plains seemed to contain an endless supply, but the Cheyenne understood what the disappearance meant. No buffalo meant less food. Less food meant less independence. Less independence meant greater dependence on government supplies. And dependence meant greater control. The destruction of the buffalo therefore became one of the most important forces in the decline of Cheyenne independence. The Cheyenne did not surrender because they suddenly became unwilling to fight. They were being surrounded by a system that made resistance increasingly difficult. The United States could attack with soldiers. It could restrict access to supplies. It could control reservation boundaries. It could encourage settlement, and it could allow commercial hunters to destroy the herds that supported native communities. The pressure came from every direction, yet the Cheyenne continued to resist in different ways. Some warriors joined the Lakota, others traveled with Northern Cheyenne groups. Some remained connected to the Southern Cheyenne. The distinction between northern and southern communities had become increasingly important. The Cheyenne had originally spread across a huge portion of the plains. Now government policies were dividing their communities. The Southern Cheyenne were pushed toward Indian territory. The Northern Cheyenne remained farther north. Families and relatives could find themselves separated by hundreds of miles. The division was not simply geographical, it affected political relationships, traditions, and everyday life. And the United States government increasingly tried to manage Native people as separate groups. The Cheyenne had to adapt again, but their greatest test was still coming. In the summer of 1876, a major gathering of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and other Native people formed along the Little Bighorn River. Among them were Cheyenne warriors who had refused to surrender. The situation was tense. The United States Army had launched a campaign to find Native communities living outside reservation control. Several military columns moved into the region. One of those columns included the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer was already famous. He had fought during the Civil War. He had become known for aggressive tactics. Now he was leading soldiers across the Montana Territory. His scouts searched for signs of a large native camp. Eventually, they found one. The village was enormous. Thousands of people were gathered. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho, families, warriors, children, elders. The army had expected to find a smaller community. Instead, it had discovered one of the largest gatherings of Plains people in years. The Cheyenne were there, and they would soon become part of one of the most famous battles in American history. On June 25th, 1876, the 7th Cavalry moved toward the village. Custer divided his regiment. Major Marcus Reno led one group. Captain Frederick Benteen led another. Custer took 5 companies himself. The plan was aggressive, but the native response was even faster. Warriors gathered. Horses were brought forward. Families began moving away from danger. The Cheyenne were not simply watching the battle, they were fighting. They understood what the soldiers approaching the village meant. If the army reached the camp, their families would be in danger. So warriors rode toward the soldiers. The fighting spread across the valley. Reno's attack was pushed back. Custer moved toward another part of the village. The army's forces became separated, and the native warriors began concentrating against the isolated soldiers. Among the Cheyenne warriors were experienced fighters. They knew the terrain, they knew how to move quickly, and they had a powerful reason to fight. Their families were behind them. The battle became chaotic. Smoke drifted across the hills. Horses ran through the grass. Rifles cracked across the valley. Warriors moved between ridges. Soldiers tried to find defensible positions, and Custer's 5 companies became increasingly isolated. The fighting lasted only a few hours, but the result was extraordinary. Custer and all of the soldiers under his immediate command were killed. The native force had defeated one of the most famous cavalry units in the United States Army. For the Cheyenne, the victory was deeply meaningful. It proved that resistance was still possible. It showed that the army could be defeated, and it became a powerful memory. But the victory contained a painful contradiction. The Cheyenne had won the battle, yet the United States had not been defeated. The government responded to Little Bighorn with greater determination. More soldiers would come. More pressure would be applied. The army would search for the people who had resisted, and the government would demand surrender. The victory that had seemed to offer hope would soon be followed by another period of hardship. For the Cheyenne, Little Bighorn would become both a triumph and the beginning of another difficult chapter. The battle had shown the strength of their warriors, but it had also shown how dangerous their situation had become. The United States was no longer simply trying to control the trails, it wanted the entire plains. And now the Cheyenne were standing directly in its way. The next few years would test them more severely than ever before. The buffalo would disappear. The army would pursue them. Their communities would be divided. And some would make a desperate decision to leave everything behind and run north, toward the border, toward Canada, toward one last possibility of freedom. The summer of 1876 had changed everything. The Cheyenne warriors, who had fought at Little Bighorn, had returned to their people carrying the memory of an extraordinary victory. Custer had been defeated. The 7th Cavalry had suffered a devastating loss, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the army might be forced to reconsider its campaign. But the Cheyenne soon discovered that the opposite was true. The United States government was furious. The defeat at Little Bighorn had shocked the country. Newspapers demanded answers, politicians demanded action, and military commanders were determined to find the native communities that had defeated Custer. The army would return, and this time it would come with greater numbers. For the Cheyenne, the victory at Little Bighorn did not mean the end of the war. It meant the beginning of an even more difficult struggle. The people who had gathered along the Little Bighorn River could no longer remain together. The army was searching for them. Military columns moved through the northern plains. Scouts followed trails. Soldiers searched river valleys and mountain passes. The enormous camp that had seemed so powerful only weeks earlier was now scattered. Families moved in different directions. Some traveled with the Lakota. Some followed their own Cheyenne leaders. Others began thinking about surrender. The decision was not simple. The Cheyenne had just proven that they could defeat the army in battle, but they also understood that the United States could continue sending soldiers. The army had lost hundreds of men at Little Bighorn. It could replace them. The Cheyenne could not replace their entire way of life. Every battle cost horses. Every winter weakened families. Every dead hunter meant another family struggling to survive. And the buffalo were disappearing. This was perhaps the greatest threat of all. For generations, the Cheyenne had depended upon the buffalo. The animals provided food, they provided hides, they provided materials for clothing and shelter. They supported the entire economy of the plains. But commercial hunters were destroying the herds at an astonishing rate. Railroads made transportation easier. Markets in eastern cities demanded buffalo hides. Hunters traveled across the plains by the thousands. Entire herds were slaughtered. Sometimes only the hides were taken. The rest of the animal was left to decay beneath the sun. For the Cheyenne, this was more than an environmental disaster. It was an attack on their independence. Without buffalo, how could they remain outside the reservations? How could families survive without government supplies? How could the old way of life continue? The army did not need to defeat every warrior. If the buffalo disappeared, the communities would become increasingly vulnerable. This reality became clear during the winter following Little Bighorn. The Cheyenne were hungry, the weather was harsh, their horses were weakened, and the army continued searching. Some groups decided that surrender was the only way to protect their families. Others refused. Among those still resisting were Northern Cheyenne leaders who understood that returning to the reservation could mean the end of their traditional life. Two of the most important leaders were Little Wolf and Dull Knife. They would eventually become central figures in one of the most remarkable episodes in Cheyenne history. For the moment, they were trying to survive. The army pressure continued. One community after another surrendered. Some people returned because they were exhausted. Others returned because they had no food. Some believed they could negotiate better conditions by surrendering. And some simply wanted their children to survive. The Cheyenne were being forced to make impossible choices. A warrior might want to continue fighting. But what about his family? What about an elderly parent? What about children who were hungry? What about horses that were dying? The war was no longer only about courage. It was about resources. And the United States had far more resources. By the spring of 1877, the resistance was weakening. Many Lakota leaders had surrendered. Crazy Horse had surrendered. Other native communities were returning to reservations. The Great Gathering of 1876 was over. The army had regained control of much of the region. But some Northern Cheyenne refused to accept reservation life. They did not want to remain in the Indian Territory far to the south. The climate was unfamiliar. The environment was different from the northern plains. The land did not feel like home, and the idea of being permanently confined was deeply painful. For the Northern Cheyenne, the North remained connected to their history. Their ancestors had lived there. Their hunting grounds were there. Their relatives were there. Their memories were there. But the government wanted them somewhere else. They were told to move south. They were told that the reservation system would provide food and security. But many Cheyenne believed that moving south meant abandoning their identity. Eventually, some were forced to go. They traveled south under military supervision. The journey itself was difficult. The climate was harsh. Disease spread. Food was poor. And the unfamiliar environment made life even harder. The southern plains were not the northern homeland they knew. For the Northern Cheyenne, this was unbearable. They had been separated from their traditional country. They were surrounded by government authority, and they were expected to accept a completely different way of life. But some people refused. They began planning an escape. It would become one of the most dramatic journeys in the history of the American West. In September 1878, a group of Northern Cheyenne men, women, and children left the reservation in Indian Territory. They were not simply warriors, they were families. Their goal was simple: go north, return home. The group was led by Little Wolf and Dull Knife. They knew the journey would be dangerous. The army would pursue them. They would have to cross hundreds of miles. They needed food. They needed horses. They needed to protect their children, and they had no guarantee that they would survive. But they went anyway. The journey began with determination. The group moved quickly. They crossed rivers. They traveled through grasslands. They avoided settlements whenever possible. But the army soon learned that they had escaped. Soldiers were sent after them. The chase began. The Cheyenne divided their forces at times. Some groups continued north. Others attempted to evade the soldiers. The army pursued them across the plains. This was no longer a conventional battle. It was a desperate migration. Women and children were traveling alongside warriors. Every mile north brought them closer to the homeland they remembered, but every mile also brought the possibility of another military encounter. The soldiers were not going to let them pass easily. The Cheyenne were surrounded by enemies, yet they continued. They had already survived Sand Creek. They had survived years of war. They had seen the destruction of their hunting grounds. They had seen the buffalo disappear, and they had watched their communities divided. Now they wanted only one thing: to go home. The journey would become known as the Northern Cheyenne Exodus, and it would test the courage and endurance of the people who took part in it. Along the way, some would be captured, some would be killed, families would be separated. The army would pursue them relentlessly, but the Cheyenne would keep moving north, because somewhere beyond the horizon, they believed their homeland was waiting. And perhaps after everything they had lost, home was worth risking everything to reach. The Northern Cheyenne were moving north. Behind them, the reservation in Indian Territory was disappearing into the distance. Ahead lay a homeland they had not seen for years, but between those two places stood hundreds of miles of open country, rivers, settlements, military posts, and soldiers. The journey had begun in September 1878. Little Wolf and Dull Knife were leading a group of Northern Cheyenne men, women, and children away from the reservation. They were determined to return north. They knew the army would pursue them, but remaining in the south had become unbearable. The climate was unfamiliar. Food was scarce. Disease had spread through the community, and the Cheyenne had been separated from the lands that had shaped their lives. They wanted to go home, so they moved. At first, the group traveled quickly. They knew that every hour mattered. The army would soon discover that they had escaped. Once the news spread, soldiers began moving. The Cheyenne understood that the journey would become a race. They were not carrying an army's supplies. They had families with them. They had limited food. They had horses that needed rest, and they had to protect children and elders. The army had none of those limitations. Soldiers could receive supplies from military posts. They could communicate through established routes. They could call upon reinforcements. The Cheyenne had only their knowledge of the land and their determination. As they traveled north, they tried to avoid settlements. They moved through open country. They crossed rivers. They followed trails when necessary and abandoned them when danger appeared. The group was constantly watching the horizon. A distant cloud of dust could mean approaching soldiers. A rider appearing far away could be a scout. Every sound mattered. Every decision could determine whether the family survived. The army eventually caught up with them. Fighting broke out. The Cheyenne resisted fiercely, but their goal was not to destroy the army. Their goal was escape. That distinction is important. The people traveling north were not trying to establish a new battlefield. They were trying to reach their homeland. The army, however, viewed the escape as a challenge to federal authority. Soldiers were ordered to stop them. The pursuit became relentless. The Cheyenne moved through Nebraska. They crossed the Platte River region. They traveled through country that had once been familiar hunting territory, but much had changed. Settlements had appeared, railroads were nearby. Farms occupied land that had once been open. The landscape itself was becoming unfamiliar. Still, they continued north. Along the way, some members of the group became separated. Some were captured, some were killed, others managed to escape. The journey became increasingly desperate. At times, the Cheyenne divided into smaller groups. This made it easier for some to avoid the army, but it also meant that families could be separated. For parents, that must have been terrifying. Imagine traveling through the darkness with your children beside you, knowing that soldiers could appear at any moment, knowing that food was limited, knowing that every river crossing could become dangerous, and still continuing north, because behind you was a reservation you did not want to return to, and ahead of you was a homeland you might never reach. The army eventually captured a large portion of the group. Some were taken to military facilities. Others continued north. The people who escaped became increasingly determined. They knew that surrender could mean being returned south. They did not want that. They had already experienced life in the southern reservation. They knew what awaited them, so they kept moving. The journey became a symbol of Cheyenne resistance, but it was also a human tragedy. Families suffered. People died from hunger, exhaustion, and violence. Children became separated from parents. The elderly struggled to keep up, and every day brought another challenge. Eventually, the group divided more permanently. Little Wolf and a smaller group continued north. Dull Knife and another group attempted to do the same. Their paths would lead to different outcomes. Dull Knife's group was eventually surrounded by the army in Nebraska. They were exhausted. Many were hungry. Their ammunition was limited. They had been traveling for weeks, but they still refused to give up easily. The army demanded surrender. The Cheyenne understood what surrender meant. They feared being sent back south. They had escaped the reservation because they wanted to return north. Going back was almost unthinkable, so they resisted. The confrontation became known as the Fort Robinson Breakout. In January 1879, the imprisoned Cheyenne attempted to escape. The conditions were brutal. It was winter. Temperatures were extremely low. The ground was frozen. The Cheyenne had few resources, but they broke out of confinement. Soldiers pursued them. The escape turned into a deadly struggle. Many Cheyenne were killed. Others were captured. Some disappeared into the surrounding country. The exact details of the event have been debated, but its meaning is clear. The people had chosen freedom, even when freedom carried an enormous risk. They would rather attempt the impossible journey north than accept a life they believed would destroy their community. The story of the Northern Cheyenne Exodus therefore became more than a military pursuit. It became a story about determination, about homeland, about family, and about the meaning of freedom. Meanwhile, Little Wolf's group had continued north. Their journey was difficult, but they were more successful at avoiding the army. They eventually reached the northern plains. They had done what they had set out to do. They had returned. But returning home did not mean the old world had returned. The buffalo herds were disappearing. The United States government still wanted them under reservation control, and the land around them had changed. Still, they were closer to the country they knew. Little Wolf would eventually become an important leader of the Northern Cheyenne. His journey demonstrated something that the government had not fully understood. The Cheyenne were not simply trying to escape soldiers. They were trying to preserve a connection to their homeland. That connection could not be erased by moving them hundreds of miles south. It could not be erased by changing reservation boundaries. And it could not be erased by destroying the buffalo. The people remembered where they belonged, and they were willing to risk their lives to return. The Northern Cheyenne exodus also revealed the limits of military power. The army could force people onto reservations, it could chase them, it could imprison them, but it could not easily destroy their identity. The Cheyenne had survived decades of war. They had survived Sand Creek, they had survived the Washita, they had fought at Little Bighorn, and now they had crossed hundreds of miles simply to return home. Their traditional world had been severely damaged, but the people themselves remained, and their struggle was beginning to take a different form. The great battles of the plains were coming to an end. The era of large-mounted warrior societies was disappearing. The buffalo were nearly gone. The army had established control, but the Cheyenne would now fight another kind of battle. A battle for land, a battle for families, a battle for language and tradition, a battle to keep their identity alive. The future would not be easy. The government would continue imposing new policies. Children would be sent to schools far from home. Traditional ceremonies would face restrictions. Reservation boundaries would change, and poverty would become a constant challenge. But the Cheyenne had already shown something important. They could adapt. They had done it before. They had moved across the continent. They had become people of the plains. They had learned to ride horses. They had survived warfare and epidemics. They had adapted to trade, and now they would have to adapt to a world dominated by the United States. The old Cheyenne world was fading, but it was not disappearing completely, because the people carried it with them, in their stories, in their families, in their ceremonies, in the names they remembered, and in the land they continued to call home. The journey north had been a desperate act, but it had also been a declaration. The Cheyenne were not ready to disappear. They were ready to survive. And the story of their survival was only beginning. The Cheyenne had returned north, but the northern plains they remembered were no longer the same. The buffalo herds were disappearing. Settlers were spreading across the landscape. Railroads were cutting through the old hunting grounds. And the United States government was determined to place the remaining Cheyenne under permanent reservation control. The Northern Cheyenne had survived the terrible journey from the south. They had escaped confinement. They had crossed hundreds of miles. They had lost family members along the way, but they had reached the country they considered home. Now, they had to find a way to remain there. For Little Wolf and the people who followed him, this was the beginning of a new struggle. The old days of traveling freely across the plains were ending. The government did not want independent Native communities moving wherever they wished. Officials wanted clearly defined reservations. They wanted Native people to farm. They wanted children educated according to American systems. And they wanted traditional hunting and warfare to disappear. For the Cheyenne, this created a painful contradiction. They had survived by adapting, but now the government wanted them to adapt in ways that threatened the foundations of their culture. The buffalo had once made mobility possible. Without them, the old way of life became increasingly difficult. Commercial hunters had killed enormous numbers. By the late 19th century, the great herds were nearly gone. The sight that had once seemed endless had become rare. A hunter could travel for days without finding enough buffalo to support a community. Food became more difficult to obtain, and government rations became increasingly important. This dependence gave federal officials tremendous power. If a community remained outside the reservation, it could be denied supplies. If people refused to cooperate, they could face military pressure. The reservation was therefore not simply a piece of land. It became part of a much larger system of control. The Cheyenne understood this. but they also understood that they had few alternatives. The old world was disappearing. They could not bring the buffalo back. They could not stop every settler. And they could not defeat the United States Army indefinitely. So the question became, how could the Cheyenne preserve something of themselves within a world they could no longer control? Some leaders focused on survival. Others continued resisting government policies. Many families simply tried to protect their children. And throughout all of this, the Cheyenne continued maintaining their own community life. Their language remained important. Their stories remained important. Their ceremonies remained important. Their relatives remained important. The United States could control land. It could control rations. It could control schools. But controlling people's memories was much harder. This became especially important as the government began sending Native children to boarding schools. Officials believed Native children should be separated from traditional community life. They were taught English. They were given American-style clothing. They were encouraged, and sometimes forced, to abandon aspects of their traditional identity. Hair was cut, names were changed, languages were discouraged. Traditional ceremonies faced increasing restrictions. The purpose was not simply education, it was assimilation. The government wanted Native children to become culturally American. For Cheyenne families, the experience could be devastating. Imagine a child growing up hearing Cheyenne spoken at home, then being taken far away. Imagine arriving at a school where almost everything is unfamiliar. Different language, different clothes, different rules, different expectations, and being told that the traditions of your parents are something to leave behind. Yet children carried pieces of home with them. They remembered words, they remembered songs, they remembered stories, they remembered relatives, and those memories helped preserve Cheyenne identity. The government could separate children from their communities, but it could not completely erase the connections they carried inside themselves. Meanwhile, life on the reservation remained difficult. Land was limited, resources were scarce, government agents controlled many aspects of everyday life, and federal policies repeatedly changed the amount of land available to Native communities. One of the most significant policies came with the Dawes Act of 1887. The act attempted to divide communally held reservation lands into individual allotments. The government claimed that individual ownership would encourage farming and assimilation. But the policy had another enormous consequence. Land that was considered surplus could be open to non-native settlement. This resulted in massive losses of native land across the United States. For the Cheyenne, the reservation itself became vulnerable. The land was no longer simply protected territory. It could be divided, sold, transferred, or opened to settlers. The process was often confusing and deeply unequal. Many Native families had little experience with American property law. Some lost land through sales. Others lost land because they could not pay taxes or because government policies changed. Over time, the Cheyenne homeland became smaller, again and again and again. The pattern was painfully familiar. First came promises, then agreements, then changes, then new demands. The Cheyenne had seen it before. Now they were experiencing it on the reservation. Yet something remarkable was happening beneath the surface. The Cheyenne were adapting again. They began combining elements of the New World with their own traditions. Some became farmers. Some worked for wages. Some served in the military. Some became teachers. Some became religious leaders. Others continued practicing traditional ceremonies. There was no single response. The Cheyenne were building a new way of life from the pieces that remained. This is why the phrase "fall of the Cheyenne" can be misleading. Their political independence suffered enormous losses. Their traditional economy was devastated. Their territory was reduced. Their population suffered from disease, warfare, hunger, and government policies. But the people themselves did not disappear. They survived. And survival was not passive. It required decisions, adaptation, memory, and determination. The story of a little wolf is an example. He had led his people on a desperate journey north. He had refused to accept permanent separation from their homeland. Later, he became an important figure in the northern Cheyenne community. His life represented a bridge between two worlds. He had known the old plains, he had ridden with warriors, he had lived through war, and he also lived in the reservation era. The same was true for many other Cheyenne elders. They carried memories of a world their children would never fully experience. They remembered the buffalo, the great camps, the horse herds, the hunting journeys, the ceremonies, the battles, and the people who had died. Those memories became a kind of inheritance. Parents told stories to children. Grandparents told stories to grandchildren. Names were remembered. Places were remembered. And the past remained connected to the present. The United States had transformed the plains, but it had not erased Cheyenne history. Instead, the Cheyenne entered the 20th century carrying that history with them. The world had changed. There were now towns, railroads, schools, farms, government offices, telegraph lines, and new laws. But Cheyenne families still gathered together. They still remembered their ancestors. They still spoke their language. They still practiced traditions whenever they could. The struggle was no longer primarily about defending a buffalo hunt from cavalry. It was about protecting identity. And that struggle could be just as difficult because cultural survival does not always look dramatic. There may be no battlefield, no army, no gunfire. Sometimes it is simply a parent teaching a child a word, a grandmother telling a story, a family remembering a ceremony, a community gathering together, a language being spoken after authorities once tried to suppress it. These small acts can preserve an entire world, and for the Cheyenne, they mattered enormously. By the beginning of the 20th century, the era of the Great Plains Wars was over. The warriors who had fought at Sand Creek, Washita, and Little Bighorn were aging or gone. The buffalo were largely gone. The open plains were filled with settlements. The army had established control. The Cheyenne could no longer live exactly as they had before, but they were still here, still Cheyenne, still connected to their ancestors, still carrying the memory of everything that had happened. And their story was entering a new chapter. The next challenge would be even quieter. It would be the struggle to preserve a culture while living inside a country that had once tried to replace it. The battles would no longer be fought only with rifles. They would be fought through language, family, education, religion, land, memory, and identity. The Cheyenne had lost much, but they had not lost everything. And perhaps the most important part of their story was not the moment when their old world fell, but what they managed to carry out of its ruins. The old world of the Cheyenne was fading. The buffalo were nearly gone. The great hunting grounds had been divided. Railroads crossed the plains. Settlements stood where camps had once moved freely. And the Cheyenne were now living within a system they had never chosen. But their story was far from over. The beginning of the 20th century brought a different kind of struggle. There were no great cavalry charges, no massive camps preparing for battle, no warriors riding across the open plains, in search of an enemy. Instead, the Cheyenne faced a quieter challenge. How could they remain Cheyenne in a country that had spent decades trying to change them? The answer would not be simple. Some people adapted to American institutions, others held tightly to traditional ways. Many did both. A Cheyenne family could send a child to an American school while still teaching that child the stories of their ancestors. Someone could work on a farm while remembering the old hunting traditions. A person could speak English in public and Cheyenne at home. The boundaries between the old world and the new became complicated. But culture does not always survive by remaining unchanged. Sometimes it survives by adapting. And the Cheyenne had always been people who adapted. Their ancestors had moved across regions. They had changed from agricultural communities into plains people. They had adopted horses. They had developed new forms of hunting. They had built alliances. They had survived wars. Now they had to adapt once again. One of the most important challenges was education. The United States government believed that Native children needed to be transformed. Boarding schools became an important part of that policy. Children were sometimes taken far from their families. They were expected to learn English. They were taught American customs. Traditional clothing and hairstyles were discouraged. Traditional languages were often punished. The goal was assimilation. The idea was that Native identity would gradually disappear. For the Cheyenne, the effects were painful. A child could leave home speaking Cheyenne and return years later struggling to communicate with relatives. A child could grow up without hearing the stories that had once been passed from grandparents to grandchildren. Family connections could weaken. Traditional knowledge could be lost. But the policy did not succeed completely. Children remembered. They carried words home. They remembered songs. They remembered ceremonies. And families continued teaching what they could. This became one of the quiet victories of Cheyenne survival. The language survived. The stories survived. The memories survived. And so did the names of the people who had fought during the Plains Wars. Black Kettle, Little Wolf, Dull Knife, Roman Nose, and many others. Their names continued to carry meaning. The stories of Sand Creek and Washita were not forgotten. Neither was Little Bighorn. For the Cheyenne, these events were not simply chapters in an American textbook. They were part of family history. The descendants of those who had lived through the wars continued remembering what happened. That memory became especially important as American popular culture created its own version of the West. Movies, books, paintings, and traveling shows often portrayed the Plains as a dramatic frontier filled with cowboys, soldiers, and native warriors. The real complexity was frequently reduced. Native people were turned into stereotypes. The Cheyenne were sometimes portrayed as villains. At other times, they were romanticized as symbols of a disappearing wilderness. Neither image captured the reality. The Cheyenne were not characters from a Western movie. They were people living through political, economic, and cultural change. They had families, they had governments, they had communities, they had internal disagreements, they had religious beliefs, they had hopes for the future, and they continued making decisions in a world that had become increasingly difficult. The reservation system also changed. Over time, Cheyenne communities became more connected to the American economy. Some people worked outside the reservation. Others became farmers or ranchers. Some served in the military. Others became involved in education and politics. These changes could create opportunities, but they could also create new pressures. Land remained a major issue. The allotment policies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had divided reservation lands. Much of the land that had once been held communally passed into non-native ownership. Families could lose property. Communities could lose control over their territory. The result was economic hardship. that lasted for generations. Yet the Cheyenne continued rebuilding. They formed organizations. They defended their legal rights. They worked to protect their land, and they preserved community institutions. The struggle had changed. The Cheyenne were no longer primarily fighting to keep cavalry out of their hunting grounds. They were fighting to ensure that their descendants would have a place in the future. That required new kinds of leadership, political leadership, legal knowledge, education, economic organization, and cultural preservation. The old warrior societies could not solve every new problem, but the values of courage and responsibility remained. They simply took different forms. A person defending the Cheyenne language could be showing courage. A family protecting traditional ceremonies could be showing courage. A community fighting to preserve its land could be showing courage. The battlefield had moved, and perhaps that is one of the most important lessons of Cheyenne history. Resistance does not always look like war. Sometimes resistance is survival. Sometimes it is remembering. Sometimes it is teaching a child who they are. By the middle of the 20th century, the United States had changed dramatically. Cars crossed the plains, airplanes connected distant cities. Television brought images from across the country into people's homes. Modern towns had replaced much of the old frontier landscape. The world of the 19th century Cheyenne seemed impossibly distant, but the people who carried that history were still alive. Elders remembered stories from their grandparents. Some had heard accounts of the old buffalo hunts. Some had grown up hearing about Sand Creek. Some had family connections to warriors who had fought at Little Bighorn. The past was not gone. It was still being transmitted. And this created something powerful, a connection between generations. The descendants of the warriors were now living in a modern world, but they could still look backward. They could still ask, who were our ancestors? What did they experience? What did they lose? What did they preserve? And perhaps most importantly, what did they teach us? The answers were not always easy. The history contained terrible suffering, disease, war, forced relocation, broken treaties, land loss, cultural suppression, poverty, but it also contained extraordinary resilience. The Cheyenne survived all of those things. They survived when many Americans expected their culture to disappear. They survived the destruction of the buffalo economy. They survived reservation policies. They survived boarding schools. They survived attempts to suppress their language and traditions. And they continued to identify themselves as Cheyenne. That survival changed the meaning of the phrase, the fall of the Cheyenne. Their political power had fallen. Their territory had been reduced. Their traditional economy had been devastated. But the Cheyenne themselves had not fallen away. They remained, and they continued shaping their own future. The 20th century brought new opportunities to reclaim what had been threatened. Native activism grew. Legal battles challenged government policies. Communities worked to preserve languages. Cultural programs were created. Young people began reconnecting with traditions that earlier generations had been pressured to abandon. The story was turning again. For centuries, the Cheyenne had adapted to changing circumstances. Now they were using that same ability to preserve their identity in the modern world. The plains would never return to the way they had looked in the early 19th century. The buffalo herds would never again cover the horizon in quite the same way. The old trails had become roads. The camps had become memories. The warrior societies belonged to another era. But the connection between the Cheyenne and the land remained. A river could still carry an old name. A hill could still hold an old story. A family could still remember where an ancestor had camped. A song could still carry a memory across generations. History could survive in places that no textbook could fully describe. And that was the great transformation taking place. The Cheyenne were no longer simply defending the old world. They were carrying pieces of it into the new one. The struggle continued, but it had become quieter, and perhaps that made it harder to notice. There were no headlines announcing every family that kept speaking Cheyenne, no newspapers reporting every ceremony preserved, no soldiers watching every child learn an ancestral story. But these things mattered, because every generation that remembered made it harder for the past to disappear. The Cheyenne had lost enormous amounts, but they had also carried something forward: identity, memory, language, family, and the determination to remain a people. The old plains were gone, but the Cheyenne were still here, and their story was entering another chapter. The Cheyenne had entered a new century. The great battles of the plains were over. The cavalry no longer crossed the horizon in search of villages. The buffalo were no longer found in the enormous herds remembered by the elders, and the old trails had become roads, railways, farms, and towns. Yet the Cheyenne remained. Their world had changed, but their identity had not disappeared. And now, a new generation was growing up. They were born into a country their grandparents could hardly have imagined. They saw automobiles instead of wagon trains. They heard trains instead of cavalry columns. They attended schools. They worked in towns. They lived on reservations that had become permanent communities. But inside their families, the old stories continued. An elder might tell a child about the buffalo. Another might remember a relative who had fought in the Plains Wars. Someone might speak quietly about Sand Creek. Someone else might tell stories about Little Wolf and Dull Knife, and the names of the ancestors remained alive. This was important, because the United States had once attempted to separate Native children from their communities in the hope that traditional identities would disappear. But identity proved harder to destroy than officials had imagined. The Cheyenne remembered, they adapted, and they continued teaching their children who they were. The 20th century also brought a new kind of political struggle. The Cheyenne had learned that military resistance alone could not protect their communities. The United States was too powerful, so the struggle increasingly moved into courts, government offices, schools, and political organizations. Land remained one of the most important issues. For generations, Cheyenne families had watched their homeland become smaller. Treaties had promised territory. Later policies had reduced it. Allotment had divided communal lands. Non-native settlement had expanded, and many native families had lost property. But land was not simply an economic resource. It was connected to memory. A particular valley might be associated with an ancestor. A river might be connected to an old story. A hill might be remembered as the place where warriors once gathered. Losing land therefore meant losing pieces of history. The Cheyenne continued working to protect what remained, and they also began looking backward with new purpose. Historians, elders, and community members worked to preserve oral traditions, stories that had once been passed privately within families became increasingly important to cultural preservation. The history of the Cheyenne could no longer be told only through military reports written by American officers. The Cheyenne themselves had a voice. Their ancestors had witnessed the events. They had remembered them, and those memories could reveal details that official records often ignored. The story of Sand Creek, for example, could not be understood fully without listening to Cheyenne descendants. For years, American accounts had described battles and military operations, but Native families remembered something else. They remembered the people who relatives. They remembered the people who had been killed. They remembered the promises that had been made, and they remembered the pain that followed. As Native voices became more widely heard, The national understanding of the American West began to change. The old image of heroic soldiers confronting savage enemies became harder to defend. The history was more complicated. The Cheyenne had not simply been obstacles to American expansion. They had been nations defending their homes. They had political leaders. They had diplomacy. They had economies. They had families. And they had their own ideas about the future. This changing understanding mattered. It allowed people to look at the Plains Wars differently. Sand Creek could be understood as a massacre rather than simply a military engagement. The Washita could be examined through the experiences of the Cheyenne village. Little Bighorn could be remembered not only as Custer's defeat, but as a major victory for the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne. The language of history was changing, and with it, the meaning of memory. For the Cheyenne, remembering the past was not about living in the past. It was about understanding the present. If a child knew what happened to their ancestors, they could better understand why their community existed where it did, why certain places mattered, why certain ceremonies mattered, why certain names carried weight, and why cultural survival was so important. The Cheyenne also faced modern challenges. Economic hardship remained a serious issue. Access to education and health care could be difficult. Many young people moved away from reservation communities in search of opportunities. Language loss remained a concern. Modern life created pressures that were very different from those of the 19th century. But once again, the Cheyenne adapted. Young people began finding new ways to reconnect with their heritage. Traditional arts were preserved, historical research expanded, language programs developed, cultural events brought families together, and stories that had survived for generations found new audiences. The past was being carried forward through modern tools, books, museums, schools, recordings, archives, and community programs. The Cheyenne were no longer simply subjects of history. They were becoming active keepers of their own history. This was a major change. For much of the 19th century, outsiders had written about the Cheyenne. Soldiers wrote reports. Government officials wrote treaties. Newspapers wrote stories. Artists created paintings. But the Cheyenne themselves had often been left without control over the narrative. Now, they could tell their own stories. They could explain what events meant to them. They could challenge inaccurate portrayals. And they could decide which memories should be passed to future generations. That process continues today. The story of the Cheyenne is still being researched. New documents are discovered. Old assumptions are questioned. Oral histories are preserved. Archaeological evidence adds new information. And descendants continue sharing family memories. History becomes richer when all of these voices are heard. The story also reminds us that the phrase rise and fall can be misleading. There was certainly a rise in Cheyenne influence on the plains. They became powerful horsemen. They developed strong alliances. They became important participants in the political and military world of the Great Plains. And there was certainly a fall in political independence. Their lands were reduced. Their buffalo-based economy was destroyed. Their communities were forced onto reservations. Their traditions faced severe pressure. But if we say that the Cheyenne simply fell, we risk ending the story too soon. Because after the fall, they remained, they rebuilt, they adapted, they remembered, and they continued. The descendants of the people who rode across the plains in the 19th century still carry that heritage. The names of old leaders still matter. The stories of the great battles still matter. The memories of those who died still matter. And the connection to the land still matters. The modern Cheyenne world is not the world of 1850. It never could be. History cannot simply be reversed. But survival does not require returning to the past. It requires carrying what matters into the future. That is what the Cheyenne have done. They carried their identity through war, through forced relocation, through hunger, through disease, through boarding schools, through land loss, through government policies designed to change them, and through a century of enormous social transformation. Their survival is therefore not a footnote to the history of the American West. It is one of its central stories. The Cheyenne were not simply people who resisted the frontier. They were people who lived through its creation. They experienced the arrival of the United States. They experienced the destruction of the buffalo economy. They experienced military conquest. They experienced reservation life, and they experienced modern America. Through every transformation, they remained connected to one another, and perhaps that is the quietest lesson of their history. A nation can lose land. A people can lose political power. A way of life can disappear. But memory can survive. Language can survive. Family can survive. Culture can survive. And when those things survive, the story is not over. The Cheyenne story had entered a new era. The battles of the 19th century had ended, but the struggle for identity continued. And in the decades ahead, the Cheyenne would face another question, not whether they could survive the United States, but how they could shape their own future within it. The story of the Cheyenne had entered a new chapter. The battles of the 19th century were over. The buffalo hunts that had once defined life on the plains were largely memories. The great camps had disappeared, and the warriors who had once ridden across hundreds of miles of open country were growing old. But the Cheyenne were still here, and now their struggle was becoming quieter. It was no longer mainly about fighting an approaching army. It was about protecting something that could not easily be seen on a map: identity, language, memory, family, and the right to decide what it meant to be Cheyenne. For much of the 19th century, American officials had believed that native cultures would eventually disappear. They thought that if children were educated in American schools, if families adopted farming, if traditional ceremonies were restricted, and if reservation life replaced the old nomadic world, native identity would gradually fade. But the Cheyenne proved otherwise. They adapted without completely surrendering who they were. That process was not easy. For many families, the memories of the Plains Wars remained painful. Older people remembered the destruction of villages. They remembered relatives who had died. They remembered the hunger that followed the disappearance of the buffalo. They remembered forced journeys, and they remembered promises that had been broken. These memories became part of family history. A child might hear the name of an ancestor and learn that person had fought at Little Bighorn. Another might hear stories about Sand Creek. Someone else might remember a relative who had traveled north with Little Wolf or Dull Knife. These were not distant stories. They were connections between generations. The Cheyenne also faced the challenge of preserving their language. Language carries more than words. It carries ways of describing the world. It carries relationships. It carries humor. It carries history. And when a language disappears, parts of a culture can disappear with it. For decades, boarding schools and government policies had discouraged native languages. Children were often punished for speaking their own language. Many were taught that English was the language of success. Some returned home unable to speak fluently with their grandparents. This created a painful gap between generations. But the language survived. Elders continued speaking it. Families continued using it. And later generations began making greater efforts to preserve and teach it. The struggle to protect language became one of the most important forms of cultural survival. The same was true of traditional knowledge. The Cheyenne had developed deep knowledge of the plains. They understood plants, animals, weather, seasonal movements, horses, hunting, and the landscape itself. Much of this knowledge had been connected to a world that no longer existed, but pieces of it could still be preserved. Stories could explain why certain places mattered. Ceremonies could connect people with their ancestors. Traditional arts could preserve patterns and meanings, and family histories could keep old names alive. The Cheyenne were adapting again, but this time they were adapting to modern America. Cars replaced horses. Roads replaced many old trails. Cities expanded. Technology transformed everyday life. Children grew up surrounded by influences from outside their communities. Some moved away to find work. Others remained close to home. Many lived between two worlds. They could participate fully in modern American society while still maintaining a strong connection to Cheyenne identity. This was not necessarily a contradiction. It was another form of adaptation. The Cheyenne had always changed when circumstances demanded it. They had changed their environment. They had adopted horses. They had developed new alliances. They had learned new technologies. They had survived enormous political transformations. Now they were learning how to preserve their culture in a modern world. Land remained central to this effort. Even after the great losses of the 19th century, the remaining reservation lands represented more than property. They were connected to community. A homeland allows people to gather. It provides places for ceremonies. It gives families a physical connection to their ancestors, and it creates a sense of continuity. The Cheyenne understood this, so land protection became an important part of modern political life. The struggle increasingly moved into courts and government offices. Instead of rifles, there were legal arguments. Instead of cavalry, there were lawyers, historians, activists, and community leaders. The battlefield had changed, but the question remained familiar. Who gets to decide what happens to Cheyenne land and Cheyenne people? That question had existed since the first treaties. Now it was being asked in a modern political system. The Cheyenne also began taking greater control over how their history was presented. This was especially important because popular American culture had often simplified the story of the plains. Movies and novels frequently portrayed Native people as either enemies or romantic figures from a vanished frontier. Neither image was complete. The Cheyenne were not simply warriors, and they had not vanished. They were living communities with modern families, modern concerns, and a history stretching back centuries. As more Cheyenne voices entered historical discussions, the story of the American West became more complicated. Sand Creek was remembered from the perspective of survivors. Black Kettle was increasingly understood not merely as a native leader, but as a man who repeatedly attempted to protect his people through diplomacy. Little Wolf and Dull Knife became symbols of determination. The Northern Cheyenne Exodus became a story not simply about military pursuit, but about families trying to return home. And Little Bighorn could be understood as more than the story of Custer's defeat. It was also a moment when Cheyenne warriors fought alongside other Plains nations to defend their families and their way of life. These perspectives changed the meaning of history. The Cheyenne were no longer simply characters inside someone else's story. They were telling their own. And perhaps that is one of the greatest changes of the modern era. For generations, outsiders had described the Cheyenne. Now, Cheyenne historians, writers, artists, teachers, elders, and community leaders could preserve their own interpretations. They could decide what should be remembered. They could correct old mistakes. They could teach younger generations. And they could remind the wider world that the story never ended in 1876 or 1878. The Cheyenne story continued. It continued through families, through communities, through ceremonies, through language, through education, and through the simple act of remembering. There were still difficulties. Economic challenges remained. Historical trauma did not disappear. Some traditions had been weakened. Some languages were endangered. And many families continued to deal with the consequences of policies created generations earlier. But survival itself was evidence of resilience. The United States had once imagined that the Cheyenne would eventually disappear into American society. Instead, the Cheyenne entered the modern world carrying their identity with them, not unchanged, but alive. And perhaps that distinction matters. Culture does not have to remain frozen in the past to be authentic. A living culture changes. It absorbs new experiences. It responds to new challenges. It learns new tools. But it remembers where it came from. That is what the Cheyenne had been doing for generations. They had changed without completely losing themselves. They had survived without forgetting their ancestors. And they continued to teach their children that their history was not merely a story of defeat. It was also a story of endurance, a story of people who lost enormous amounts, yet refused to disappear, a story of families who carried memories across generations, a story of leaders who made difficult choices, a story of warriors who fought when they believed fighting was necessary, and a story of people who learned that survival sometimes required a different kind of courage, the courage to remember, the courage to adapt, and the courage to continue. The old plains were gone, but the Cheyenne remained connected to them, in memory, in language, in family, and in the stories told beneath the same wide skies. Their history had survived the battlefield. Now it had to survive the modern world, and the next generation would inherit that responsibility. The story of the Cheyenne had never truly been a story of disappearance. It was a story of transformation. The world that had existed before American expansion was gone. The great buffalo herds were gone. The old trails had become roads. The horse-centered life of the plains had changed. And the political independence of the Cheyenne had been severely reduced. But the people remained. And as the 20th century moved forward, they faced a new question. How could they protect their identity in a country that had spent generations trying to reshape it? The answer began with something simple: remembering. Cheyenne families continued telling stories. Grandparents spoke about ancestors. Parents taught children names. Elders remembered places that no longer looked the same. A hill that seemed ordinary to an outsider could carry the memory of an entire generation. A river could be connected to an old journey. A name could carry the story of a warrior. A ceremony could connect the living with people who had died long ago. Memory became a bridge. It connected the modern Cheyenne world with the world of the plains. But memory alone was not enough. The Cheyenne also had to protect their communities. Reservation life had created difficult economic conditions. Land loss had reduced opportunities. Government policies had weakened traditional systems. And many families faced poverty. Yet Cheyenne communities continued developing their own institutions. Political leadership became increasingly important. Education became a tool rather than simply an instrument of government assimilation. Young people could learn the history that officials had once tried to suppress. They could study American society while also learning about their own ancestors. This created a new generation with a different kind of strength. They could move between worlds. They could understand modern institutions, but they could also understand where they came from. That balance would become increasingly important. The Cheyenne had learned that isolation was no longer possible. They were part of the United States, but being part of the United States did not mean giving up their identity. That distinction shaped much of their modern history. Native political activism grew throughout the 20th century. Across the country, indigenous people increasingly demanded greater control over their communities. They challenged policies that had been imposed upon them. They defended treaty rights. They fought for land. They demanded better education. They worked to preserve languages. And they insisted that Native nations should have a voice in decisions affecting their own people. The Cheyenne were part of this broader movement. Their struggle had changed again. In the 19th century, the struggle had often been fought on horseback. Now it could be fought through petitions, courts, elections, organizations, schools, and public campaigns. The goal remained remarkably familiar: protect the community, protect the land, protect the future, and protect the memory of the past. One of the most powerful changes was the growing effort to preserve Cheyenne history through their own voices. For generations, outsiders had written about the Cheyenne. Army officers wrote reports. Government agents wrote documents. Newspapers published stories. Artists created images. But many of these accounts reflected the perspectives of the people who held political and military power. Cheyenne oral traditions offered another perspective. They preserved details that official records sometimes ignored. They remembered the experiences of women and children. They remembered families who had been separated. They remembered the emotional consequences of events such as Sand Creek and the Northern Cheyenne Exodus. These memories were essential because history is not only about what happened, it is also about how people experienced what happened. A military report might describe an attack in a few paragraphs. A family might remember it for generations. One version could say that an operation had been successful. Another could remember the names of those who died. Both are historical evidence, but only one may reveal what the event meant to the people who lived through it. This growing recognition helped transform the way the Cheyenne story was understood. The old image of the American West began to change. The frontier was no longer seen simply as a place where brave settlers and soldiers created a new nation. It was also a place where indigenous nations struggled to survive the arrival of that new nation. The Cheyenne were not simply part of the scenery. They were historical actors. They made decisions. They negotiated. They fought. They adapted. They suffered. And they survived. Their leaders made difficult choices under impossible circumstances. Black Kettle believed peace might protect his people. Little Wolf believed returning north was worth risking everything. Dull Knife refused to accept a future that meant abandoning his homeland. Other leaders chose different paths. None of them could see the future. They could only make the best decisions they could with the information available to them. That is another reason their story remains so powerful. History is often easier to understand after the outcome is known, but the people who lived through it did not know what would happen next. When Black Kettle sought peace, he did not know that Sand Creek would happen. When Cheyenne warriors fought at Little Bighorn, they did not know that the army would return with even greater force. When Little Wolf led his people north, he did not know whether they would survive the journey. They were making decisions in darkness, and sometimes they chose courage. As the 20th century progressed, the Cheyenne also worked to preserve traditional cultural practices. Ceremonies remained important, traditional arts remained important, family relationships remained important, the language remained important. These things became especially meaningful because earlier government policies had attempted to weaken them. Every preserved tradition represented continuity, a connection between generations, a reminder that the Cheyenne were not simply descendants of a vanished plains culture. They were a living people, and living cultures change. The Cheyenne adapted to modern technology. They entered new professions. They attended universities. They worked in government. They became teachers, artists, writers, soldiers, lawyers, doctors, and community leaders. But they could do all of these things while remaining connected to their heritage. Modernity did not have to mean disappearance. That realization was important. For a long time, American policy had been based on the assumption that Native identity was something temporary, something that would eventually vanish. The survival of the Cheyenne proved otherwise. They could live in the modern world without abandoning their history. They could use modern institutions to protect old traditions. They could use education to preserve language. They could use historical research to recover forgotten stories. And they could use political power to defend their communities. This was a different kind of victory. It was not the victory of Little Bighorn. There were no soldiers retreating, no battlefield covered in smoke, no dramatic cavalry charge. Instead, it was quieter. A child learning a Cheyenne word, a family attending a ceremony, an elder telling a story, a community gathering, a young person asking about an ancestor, a historian recording an oral tradition before it disappeared. These moments might seem small, but together they represented survival. And survival had become one of the central themes of Cheyenne history. The 19th century had tested their ability to fight. The 20th century tested their ability to remain. And they did. The Cheyenne entered the modern age carrying both grief and pride. They remembered what had been lost, but they also remembered what had survived. Their people, their stories, their families, their identity, their connection to the land, and their determination to shape their own future. The history of the Cheyenne, therefore, cannot end with the disappearance of the buffalo. It cannot end at Sand Creek. It cannot end at the Washita. It cannot end at Little Bighorn. And it cannot end with the northern Cheyenne exodus. Those events were chapters, painful chapters, important chapters, but only chapters. The story continued, and perhaps the greatest surprise in that story is that the people who were once expected to disappear are still here, still remembering, still adapting, still telling their stories, and still looking toward the future. The old world is gone, but the people who came from it remain, and their journey is not finished. The story of the Cheyenne had traveled a very long way, from the northern forests and river valleys of their early history to the open grasslands of the Great Plains, from agricultural villages to a life shaped by horses, buffalo, and enormous seasonal migrations, from powerful alliances and warrior societies to the terrible conflicts of the 19th century, and finally, to a modern world that looked completely different from the one their ancestors had known. But through all of those changes, one thing remained: the Cheyenne themselves. They had lost enormous amounts of land. They had lost the buffalo. They had lost political independence. They had lost relatives in wars and massacres. They had endured forced relocation, hunger, disease, boarding schools, and government policies designed to transform their culture. And yet, they had survived. By the later 20th century, survival itself had become a powerful part of Cheyenne identity. The old battles were remembered, but new battles had appeared. They were battles over language, land, education, history, political authority, and the right to decide what the future of the Cheyenne people would look like. One of the most important changes was the growing effort to reclaim history. For generations, much of the written history of the Plains had been produced by outsiders. Army officers described battles, government officials described treaties, newspapers described Native resistance, Popular writers created stories about the frontier, but these accounts often presented the Cheyenne through someone else's eyes. The Cheyenne had their own histories. They had oral traditions. They had family stories. They had memories passed from grandparents to grandchildren, and these memories could reveal a different understanding of the past. A massacre could not be understood simply as a military engagement. A treaty could not be understood only by reading the government's version. A battle could not be understood without asking why people fought. The Cheyenne perspective added something essential: human experience, the experience of families, the experience of women and children, the experience of people who had lost their homes, the experience of people who had been forced to travel hundreds of miles, and the experience of people who continued living afterward. This changed the way historians approached the story. Events like Sand Creek became subjects of deeper investigation. Researchers returned to old documents. They listened to descendants. They compared written records with oral traditions. And they began to understand that the history of the American West could not be told from one perspective alone. This was especially important for younger Cheyenne generations. Knowing their history gave them a connection to people who had lived through extraordinary circumstances. A young person could learn about Black Kettle and understand that he was not simply a name in a history book. He was a leader trying to protect his people in a rapidly changing world. A young person could learn about Little Wolf and understand the courage required to lead families hundreds of miles north in search of home. A young person could learn about Dull Knives and understand why returning south after escaping to the north seemed impossible. A young person could learn about the warriors at Little Bighorn and understand that they were defending a community, not simply seeking a fight. The past became personal, and when history becomes personal, it becomes much harder to erase. The Cheyenne also continued protecting their cultural traditions. Language became especially important. A language carries knowledge that cannot always be translated perfectly. It contains ways of describing relationships. It carries humor and emotion. It contains names for places and things that may have no exact equivalent in English. When an ancestral language disappears, an entire way of seeing the world can become harder to access. For that reason, language preservation became a major concern. Elders became teachers. Schools and community programs became places where younger generations could learn. Words that had once been discouraged could be spoken openly again. The process was not easy. Many fluent speakers had grown old. Some words had already disappeared from everyday use, but the effort itself was important. Every word remembered was a connection to the past. Every child who learned a traditional phrase became another link in the chain. The same was true of ceremonies and traditional arts: beadwork, quill work, dance, songs, stories, traditional clothing. These were not simply decorations or performances. They carried history, they carried identity, and they reminded the community that Cheyenne culture was not something that existed only in museums. It was alive, it could change, it could incorporate modern influences, but it remained connected to its roots. This was perhaps the greatest difference between the Cheyenne of the late 20th century and the people described by 19th century government officials. The government had once assumed that native cultures would eventually disappear. Instead, the Cheyenne had entered modern America with their culture still alive. They had learned to use modern institutions without surrendering their identity. Education became a tool for preservation. Political organization became a tool for protecting communities. Historical research became a tool for recovering lost stories. And modern technology became a tool for teaching younger generations. The Cheyenne were not trying to recreate the 19th century. They knew that world could not return. The buffalo herds could not simply be restored to their former numbers. The railroads could not be removed. The cities could not be erased. The political boundaries of the United States could not simply disappear. Instead, the challenge was to carry the important parts of the old world into the new one. That meant remembering the values that had helped their ancestors survive: community, responsibility, generosity, courage, respect for elders, connection to family, and connection to the land. These values could exist in a modern world. They did not require a return to the battlefield. They required continuity. The Cheyenne story also became increasingly important to the wider American understanding of history. For a long time, the American West had been presented as a story of expansion and conquest. But the more people listened to native voices, the more complicated that story became. The West was not empty. The land was not simply waiting for settlers. The Cheyenne and other Plains nations already had societies, economies, governments, traditions, and histories. The arrival of the United States did not create the West. It transformed an existing world, sometimes through trade, sometimes through treaties, sometimes through settlement, and sometimes through violence. Understanding this does not erase the courage of American settlers or soldiers. It simply places their experiences alongside those of the people who were already there. History becomes larger when more voices are included, and the Cheyenne voice is essential. Their story also reminds us that defeat and disappearance are not the same thing. The Cheyenne lost military battles. They lost territory. They lost political freedom. They lost the buffalo economy, but they did not lose their identity. Their survival challenges the old idea that history moves only in one direction. A people can experience catastrophic loss and still rebuild. A culture can be attacked and still survive. A language can be suppressed and still return. A community can lose its homeland and still maintain a deep relationship with that land. That is the deeper story beneath the phrase, the rise and fall of the Cheyenne. There was a rise. There was a devastating fall in political power, but there was also survival after the fall. And survival created something new, a modern Cheyenne identity connected to an ancient past. The old warrior world was gone, but the people were still here. The buffalo hunts had ended, but the stories remained. The great camps had disappeared, but families remained connected. The battles were over, but the memory of those battles continued shaping the present. And perhaps that is where the true meaning of the story can be found. Not in the moment when the Cheyenne lost their freedom, but in everything they did afterward. They remembered, they adapted, they rebuilt, and they continued. As the 20th century approached its final decades, the Cheyenne were no longer simply looking backward. They were beginning to look forward. The question was no longer only how to survive the changes imposed upon them. It was how to shape their own future, and that future would belong to the next generation. The story of the Cheyenne began long before the American West had a name. It began with a people moving across generations of landscapes, learning, adapting, building communities, and carrying their traditions wherever they traveled. They became people of the plains. They learned to follow the buffalo. They became skilled horsemen. They built powerful alliances. They defended their families. And for a time, their world seemed almost endless. Then the United States came west. At first, there were traders, then wagon trails, then settlers, then railroads, then soldiers, and slowly, the world of the Cheyenne began to shrink. Treaties were signed, promises were made, land was taken, the buffalo disappeared, and the Cheyenne were forced into a struggle unlike anything their ancestors had known. They fought when they believed fighting was necessary. They negotiated when they believed peace might save their people. They adapted when circumstances left them no other choice, and sometimes they simply tried to survive. The story of Black Kettle captures the tragedy of that era. He wanted peace. He believed that his people could survive if they negotiated with the United States. But at Sand Creek in 1864, that hope was shattered. Men, women, and children were killed. A community was devastated. And the memory of Sand Creek became part of Cheyenne history forever. Black Kettle survived that tragedy, but he would not survive the Washita. 4 years later, another attack destroyed his village. Again, the Cheyenne experienced the terrible consequences of trusting promises that were not honored. But the story did not end there. The Cheyenne continued resisting. Their warriors fought across the plains. They joined with the Lakota and other nations. And in 1876, they became part of one of the most famous victories in the history of the American West. At Little Bighorn, Cheyenne warriors fought alongside their allies against George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry. The army was defeated. Custer was killed. And, for a brief moment, the Cheyenne and their allies had demonstrated that the United States could still be stopped. But the victory could not reverse the larger transformation. The army returned. The pressure increased. The buffalo herds were destroyed. Communities were forced onto reservations. Families were separated. And the traditional Plains way of life became increasingly difficult to maintain. Some Cheyenne surrendered, others resisted, and some refused to accept a future far from their homeland. Little Wolf and Dull Knife became symbols of that determination. In 1878, Northern Cheyenne men, women, and children left the southern reservation and began a desperate journey north. They crossed hundreds of miles. They faced soldiers, they faced hunger, they faced winter. They lost people along the way, but they continued, because home was not simply a place on a map. Home was memory. Home was family. Home was the land where their ancestors had lived. And eventually, some of them reached the northern plains. They had survived. But survival did not mean returning to the old world. The buffalo were gone. The open hunting grounds were gone. The great camps were gone. The old political independence was gone. What remained was something more difficult to destroy: the people, the language, the stories, the memories, the identity. And this is where the story of the Cheyenne becomes more than a story about war. It becomes a story about survival. Because when we speak of the fall of the Cheyenne, we have to be careful. Their political power fell. Their territory was reduced. Their traditional economy was devastated. Their communities suffered enormously, but the Cheyenne themselves did not disappear. They entered the 20th century. They entered the modern world, and they carried their history with them. Children were sent to schools where they were sometimes taught to abandon their language and traditions. Yet many remembered. Families faced poverty and land loss. Yet communities endured. Traditional ceremonies faced pressure. Yet they survived. The Cheyenne language was discouraged, yet speakers continued teaching it. The government attempted to reshape Native identity, yet the Cheyenne continued identifying themselves as Cheyenne. This was not the survival of a museum piece. It was the survival of a living people, a people capable of changing without forgetting. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of this entire journey. Cultures are not frozen in time. The Cheyenne of today are not expected to live exactly as their ancestors did in the 18th or 19th centuries. The world has changed, technology has changed, economics have changed, politics have changed, but identity can survive change. The Cheyenne can live in the modern world while remembering the old one. They can use modern schools while preserving traditional knowledge. They can work in modern professions while maintaining connections to their communities. They can use modern technology to preserve ancient stories. And they can teach new generations about people whose lives once seemed destined to disappear from history. Black Kettle can still be remembered. Little Wolf can still be remembered. Dull Knife can still be remembered. Roman Nose can still be remembered. The warriors of Little Bighorn can still be remembered. And the women, children, elders, hunters, teachers, and families whose names never appeared in famous books can be remembered too. Because history is not only made by famous leaders, it is made by ordinary people who survive extraordinary circumstances. A mother teaching her child a traditional word, an elder telling a story, a family returning to a place connected to an ancestor, a young person learning a ceremony, a community protecting its land. These acts may not appear in dramatic paintings. There may be no battlefield, no cavalry, no gunfire, but they are acts of survival. And sometimes, survival is the greatest victory of all. Today, when we look across the Great Plains, it can be difficult to imagine the world that existed before the railroads. The buffalo are no longer covering the horizon. The old trails have become highways. Towns stand where camps once moved. Farms stretch across former hunting grounds. And the sounds of modern life have replaced the sounds of the 19th century plains. But history remains beneath the surface, in place names, in family stories, in museums, in memorials, in ceremonies, and in the people who still carry Cheyenne identity into the future. The landscape changed. The people changed. But the connection endured. And perhaps that is why the story of the Cheyenne should not end with defeat. It should end with continuation, because the final chapter of their history has not been written. The Cheyenne are still here, still remembering, still teaching, still adapting, still telling stories. The rise of the Cheyenne was remarkable. Their transformation into a powerful Plains people was extraordinary. Their resistance against American expansion was courageous. Their losses were devastating. Their political defeat was real, but their survival was just as real. And that survival changes the meaning of everything that came before. Sand Creek was not the end. The Washita was not the end. Little Bighorn was not the end. The Northern Cheyenne Exodus was not the end. Reservation life was not the end. Boarding schools were not the end. The Cheyenne continued, generation after generation, carrying pieces of the old world into the new. So tonight, as we leave the wide plains behind, imagine the grass moving beneath the evening wind. Imagine a distant herd of buffalo, not as a memory of extinction, but as a reminder of the world that once existed. Imagine horses moving across the horizon. Imagine the sound of a Cheyenne language being spoken around a family gathering. Imagine an elder telling a child the names of ancestors, and imagine that child listening, remembering, and one day telling the story again. That is how history survives, not only in books, not only in monuments, but in people. The Cheyenne story is therefore not a story of a people who vanished. It is a story of a people who endured one of the most dramatic transformations in American history. They lost much. They suffered greatly, but they remained, and their story continues. So as the night grows quiet, let the plains fade into darkness. Let the wind move softly across the grass. Let the old trails disappear beneath the stars. The battles are over. The cavalry is gone. The buffalo hunts belong to another age. But the voices of the past remain, whispering through family stories, whispering through old names, whispering through the memories carried by generations. And perhaps that is the true ending of the story. Not disappearance, not defeat, but survival. The Cheyenne are still here, and as long as their stories continue to be told, their history will never be silent. Thank you for spending this journey with Whispered History. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Whispered History for more long-form journeys through the forgotten, fascinating, and sometimes heartbreaking chapters of history. Now, close your eyes. Take a slow breath. Let the modern world become quiet. Imagine the Great Plains beneath a vast night sky. The grass is moving gently. The stars are above you. And somewhere in the darkness, the old stories are still being told. Good night, and until our next journey, let history whisper you to sleep.